I'm in the wind now. I'm sure I'll be dead by tomorrow, but I need to let people know this thing is loose. I'm an agent with the United States government, and my station is Black Site number 7. I won't tell you my name. It wouldn't matter much anyway, but this was not how I saw my life going. I spent 6 years in Iraq, signed up right after high school. It was nothing like the recruiter told me it would be. I spent 8 hours in the blistering heat. I hauled my fair share of comrades out of firefights, and I saw a lot of crap out there that would make an ordinary person go crazier than I might be. I've had a camel spider crawl on me while I sleep. I watched friends I've known since basic get decapitated through binoculars, burned houses full of insurgents and civilians to rubble, and a lot of other things I really don't like to talk about. When I was done, they gave me my papers, thanked me for my service, and sent me home. I know I have no right to complain. Many guys didn't make it back, but home was worse. I'd spent 6 years in an active combat zone, and now I was just, supposed to come home and go back to civilian life? I spent 3 months in the civilian world. 2 of those months were spent in crappy apartments because my parents couldn't handle the night terrors and the jumpy Marine that their son had become. Every car horn, every barking dog, every firework rattling in the street had me reaching for my gun or breaking into a cold sweat when I couldn't find it. Before TJ found me, I was honestly considering killing myself. Then one day, he was just at my door with that big shit-eating grin he'd always worn in the desert. "You look like hell, Hoss. Let me get you some pancakes. I got something I want to discuss with you." TJ was my platoon leader in the sandbox. They called him the comedian because he was always smiling, always cracking jokes. He was a functional sociopath. I guess most of us were. I always admired his ability to laugh in the face of the messed up stuff we did. TJ is not his real name, clearly, but since he's still in this crap and I've left it behind, I figure the best I can do is not remind them that he's why I'm here. So he took me to breakfast. In the back of a crowded Denny's, he laid it all out for me. "You got it bad, Hoss, but that's okay, 'cause old Uncle TJ has the cure for you. Got a new job, familiar work that might interest you. Ever hear of Two Trees?" As it happened, I had. Two Trees was a government institute that, on the surface, did a lot of medical research and clinical trials. Underneath, though, they did wet work, and anyone who was involved in covert ops knew about Two Trees. We'd worked with them a few times in Iraq, and their guys were spooky, to say the least. "You're looking at the new head of Black Site number 7. I furrowed my brow at him. "Congrats. Should I know what that is?" "Of course not. It's a closely guarded government secret. Two Trees is paying me a small fortune to keep it that way. Problem is, I need someone to curate the site for me. Someone with military training, experience with firearms, and a need for some normalcy. Know anyone that might fit that bill, Hoss?" I knew what he was asking, but I didn't think I was the one he was looking for. I hadn't found work in 3 months since I'd been back, and most of that was because I couldn't settle into anything. I was constantly jumpy, constantly on edge, and that makes it hard to find work. No one wanted you doing security work or minding a gas station when every backfiring car was an enemy combatant. What would happen if I had an episode in a government facility of all places? I shook my head. "Thanks, but no thanks. I don't think I'm fit for duty the way I am." "Yeah, I thought you might say that." He pulled a metal tin out of his front pocket and slid it across the table. "Your medical file reads like a bench work for PTSD. Night terrors, irritability, being on edge, those irrational bouts of anger that got you thrown out of your parents' house." I felt defensive. "How did you know about that?" "You'd be surprised what my level of clearance will get you. The therapist records were about as hard to get as a beer at a gas station. Well, I got a little present for you, Hoss. Welcome to the rest of your life," he said, tapping the outside of the silver case. The case was about as big as an Altoids tin. There were no markings on it, no filigrees or needless ornaments, and it had the distinctly surgical look that you usually see with military tech. I slid my hand towards it, but I didn't seem to want to touch it. Every sense I had told me to walk away right now, not to touch that thing, and just walk away from this unassuming little case. I forced my hands to pop it open instead. Inside was a pair of gray gel caps. "What are these?" "These are the answer to your prayers. 2 of these a day will make you feel as calm and clear as you did when you were a lad of 18. No more jumping at every noise. No more reaching for your gun when a dog barks or a car backfires. Just peace of mind. Looking back, that's probably what Mephistopheles said when he spoke to Faust. What's the catch? These pills are only available through the Two Trees Corporation. Employees who agree to be part of the clinical trials get them free of charge. But they're only available to employees, he said, with a little grin. Take them. Take a day to feel the effects, and let me know what you think. Call me tomorrow and give me your answer. Enjoy a night of freedom, then make your decision. I took the pills home with me, and after a few hours of staring at them, I took them with some vodka. The effects were sudden and immediate. If you've never had PTSD, then it's hard to explain, but it's like having a loose wire and someone suddenly fixes it. Then you go back to the way you used to be. My anxiety just melted away. My fear dissipated. My unease and dread were gone, and my anger seemed like a distant memory. I was sitting in my crappy apartment, surrounded by the trappings of my depression and my anxiety, and suddenly, I felt like I had before I boarded that bus in 2003 and headed out to basic training. I was finally comfortable in my own head. It was like coming back to a safe place after years of running from danger. After the first good night's sleep I'd had since shipping out, I called TJ and told him I was in. One question, I asked. What's in the pills that makes them work so well? He was silent for a long minute, and then finally he said, You really don't want to know, Hoss. Pack your stuff. There will be a moving truck to take you to West Virginia in the morning. And that is how I came to work at Black Site number 7. I must have looked like a junkie by the time I pulled up in front of my new house. I didn't have much. The truck had taken all 4 boxes into the deep woods as I followed in my old compact. The journey took me about 16 hours, and by the time I got there, I was starting to feel the anxiety creep back in. I became angry at how slow the truck was going, afraid that this whole thing was a trick and they would kill me. By the time I arrived, I found myself wanting to die, hoping for death, so I could return to the quiet that had been in my head before. That was when I saw TJ standing at the gate of what looked like an old military checkpoint. He flashed that knowing smile and handed me another silver case. I dry swallowed the pills without a word and felt the inner peace worming its way back into my brain. Then he showed me to my new quarters. It was a little bunk room with a bed, a kitchenette, and a locker for my clothes. There was a foot locker for my personal stuff, and I was told to keep the place clean. I would be responsible for the site and its security. TJ showed me a terminal off the bedroom for monitoring and camera feeds. The compound had cameras all over the place, but I appeared to be the only person here full-time. Site's mostly for storage these days, but it's what we get up to here at night that may interest you. That's why you're here. I need someone I can trust to watch this site 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. 4 times a year, you'll be relieved for a week of R&R somewhere. But other than that, this is your world, Hoss. That didn't bother me. I had no problem being alone after 3 months of people. What I was curious about was what I would be doing out here. What am I looking at exactly? TJ pointed at the 3 buildings on the camera. Truck comes twice a week. Let them through the gate and don't bother them. They'll take what they need from the building and won't bother you either. Keep nosy people out. Lethal force is authorized, and don't ever go in there, or I'll have to show you where Black Site 8 is, he said with a smile. The smile didn't make it to his eyes. Don't worry about being vigilant, though. If anything bigger than a mouse moves out there, the alarms will let you know about it right away. He told me that my food would be delivered once a week, mostly MREs, and I could order anything I wanted from the terminal in the living room. There was a workout yard near the second building, and I could move through the woods if I chose, as long as I took my phone with me so I could get alerts from the console. By the way, hand me your phone, he said. When I did, he put it in his pocket and handed me a new one. That's your new phone. I'll take the keys to your car, too, and put the money in your account. This is your life now, Hoss, so don't take this job lightly. If you leave the grounds, we'll know. If you try to update social media or try to tell anyone on the outside about what you've seen here, we'll know. If you want to get married or feel like you need out, arrangements can be made after your first 5-year tour. As far as anyone is concerned, you no longer exist. Don't be stupid. Put in your 5 years, and we'll reassess your position then. He grinned again and punched me in the arm. And lighten up. This will be the easiest 5 years of your life. From that point on, I was an employee of Two Trees. TJ had been right. The first 5 years flew by. I lived on the site, spending my days working out or watching TV. I played the latest video games and watched the newest movies. Twice a week, as advertised, a truck rolled up and honked. I would check the cameras, open the gates, and they would do the rest. They would honk when they were ready to leave, and I left them alone. The trucks always had the Two Trees logo on them, and they never popped in to give me any crap, and I never went out to give them any. I never tried to get into the warehouses. I'd been a soldier long enough to know how to check my curiosity, and the scares were minimal. The food kept coming, the pills kept coming, and kept me in the right mind, too, and it was pretty peaceful, all told. The alarms, to my knowledge, only went off 3 times in that first year. 2 of those times, it was a deer who had wandered too close. The first time it happened, I had slunk out in a panic, service pistol in hand and boxer shorts flapping. As I rounded the first warehouse, I drew down on a very surprised doe who darted away before I could draw a bead on her. It was kind of a special moment for me. I had never seen a deer up close, and as it ran away, I was glad I hadn't shot it. The third time the alarm went off, it was a person, though. It was the first person I'd seen in 3 months. I'd been sitting at the console one night watching the latest Marvel Avengers movie. I think it might have been Infinity Wars, when the alarm went off. I paused the movie, expecting to see a deer or a rabbit on the monitor. My eyes went wide, though, when I realized it was a person. He had a crowbar. He was attempting to pry the door open. He must have come out of the woods, because if he had driven up, I would have known about it sooner. It had been 3 months since I'd seen another person. The last one had been Agent Daughtry, who'd come to relieve me for a week of R&R in September. The idea of seeing a person not connected with Two Trees made me feel weird. Even when you were on R&R, you went to a company resort or a company place full of company people. This stopped you from getting a little too drunk and talking about all the stuff you did for your country. It was a great idea, but it meant you had nearly no interaction with civilians. I took my pistol out and crept up on him in near silence. When my foot came down on an extra crunchy stick, he turned his head and noticed me. He raised the crowbar as if to attack, and the rest was instinct. The gun went off without me having even spoken to him, reflexes taking over and dropping the threat before it could become a real danger. His left eye popped like an overripe fruit, and he fell down on the hard December ground. I called TJ, and he and some of the other men in suits came to assess the damage. "You did just right, Hoss. He was a threat to the facility and needed to be put down. Don't think for a minute that this reflects poorly on you." "What will you do with him?" I asked. TJ smiled. "Immediate disposal, Hoss. Think you got the stomach to help us?" I found that I did, and once he was doused in gasoline, we set him ablaze at the edge of the property. They gave me a week of R&R for that, and when I came back, TJ must have decided that I was worthy of being brought in on certain things. The alarm went off about a week after I'd come back from R&R, and I saw a black car rolling up the front gate. TJ stepped out of it and waved as it stopped in the concrete roundabout, other men getting out as well. I slid my shoulder holster on and went out to meet him. It was 11 p.m., and a visit this late was highly irregular. As I approached the vehicle, 2 guys in suits were bringing a man with a bag on his head out of the car. He was wearing scrubs, his hands bound behind his back, and I could hear him crying beneath the black hood he wore. I looked between them, waiting for an explanation, and TJ threw an arm around me and walked me towards the spot where we had burnt the trespasser. "Hoss, I think it's time that we bring you in on the second reason for black sites. You see, sometimes Two Trees has assets that need to be eliminated. The black sites are often used for this purpose. It's always the responsibility of the site's caretaker to carry out the elimination. Fringe benefits, I suppose you could say." "Why wasn't I told of this before?" I asked, feeling indignant. "I'm no murderer." "Oh, well, those combatants in Iraq will be glad to hear that, won't they?" he said almost snidely. "That was war, TJ. This is murder. Think of this as war too, Hoss. These people are enemies, and they need to be eliminated for the good of the public safety. It's part of the job, Hoss, a part I know firsthand that you're capable of." They put the man on his knees in the middle of the burn spot, and I could hear him praying under that hood as we stood around him. "Put him down, Hoss. That's an order," TJ said. "And if I won't?" I said, looking at him icily. The 2 men on either side drew their guns, and TJ grinned. "Then I'm afraid that these men will have to execute both of you. Come on, Hoss. Don't throw this away over some nobody. He's no different than the man outside the warehouse." Looking back, I kinda just wish I'd let them shoot me. But I guess if I had, you'd never know about any of this. Instead, I drew out my gun and put a bullet in his skull, glowering at TJ as his buddies put their guns away. "You made the right choice, Hoss. Who knows? You might not have to do this more than a dozen times in the next 4 years." On that note, he was wrong. I executed an asset a month after that. They were mostly people in scrubs, people in lab coats, doctors, researchers, people who had likely tried to steal from whatever facility they worked at. They were men, women, Old men and scared 20-somethings. I never bothered to learn their names. They were just assets that needed to be eliminated. I became kind of numb to the process. We burned them afterwards. Gasoline and fire made it like they were never there. The spot near the edge had a charred look to it for a while after that. At the end of 5 years, TJ came to see me and asked if I wanted to re-up. What happens if I walk away? I asked. I was eating dinner when he came by, and he had sat down to have a plate of fettuccine with me. Given my free time, I had learned to do a good number of things that I couldn't before. I became a pretty good cook. I learned to play the guitar, read every book on the shelf I had bought to hold them, and there was a chainsaw out back along with some sculptures I had made with it. I couldn't say I hadn't enjoyed my time here, the killings aside, but I was curious to know if they'd actually let me leave. You'll be allowed to return to the real world, your bank account fuller and your retirement substantial. Just watch what you say out there. I'd hate to have to bring you back for your replacement to put a bullet in. I ended up signing up for another 4 years. I shouldn't have done that. I was 8 years deep when they brought the girl in the black bag to me. It was 2 a.m., and I had started to think about going to bed when the alarm went off. I saw the town car rolling up and looked for TJ. He was not the one that climbed out, however. This guy had his hair slicked back, his suit a perfect blue pinstripe. He didn't wave at me, and I felt a sense of dread as I grabbed my gun. Somehow I expected TJ to be under that bag this time. The man's name was Stein, and luckily he did not have TJ under that bag. What he did have was a kid with a thick black bag over their head. I couldn't tell at first if it was a boy or a girl. They were dressed in baggy clothes, Salvation Army rags that a homeless guy would be embarrassed to wear, and they were crying loudly under their hood. 2 familiar men had the kid, and they both looked stoic about the whole matter. Stein didn't say anything, just led the procession over to the charred spot and put the kid on their knees. When he didn't take the hood off, I did it myself. He winced, but he didn't stop me. This was my place, my job, and I had garnered a reputation for being a professional, a reputation I was about to ruin. The bag came off, and the little girl's tear-streaked face came into view in the harsh fluorescence. Her hair was cut short, dirty blonde, and her face was covered in bruises. Her nose looked broken, her lip split. The blood trickled down her face like red tears, and they mingled with her actual tears as they fell to the damp earth. I sighed, looking at Stein as the gun stayed at the ready. The hell is this? Stein looked surprised. It's an asset. TJ said you could handle these for us. Handle the asset. This is a kid, barely old enough to wipe her own ass. What could she have possibly done? Stein's face was stony. Yours is not to question, soldier. Liquidate this asset, or be liquidated. I looked at the kid, her whole face shaking as the tears and blood fell, and I thought about watching her head pop like a grape. This wasn't some scared adult, some stoic old man, some praying woman, or some cursing thing in a sallow skin. This was a kid. I had killed a lot of people, more in my time here than I ever had during war, but I was still a professional. Professionals had standards. No, I said. Stein blinked. What? No, I don't kill kids. Do it yourself. The 2 men drew their guns, and I was transported back in time. I was standing there, 2 days after Christmas, watching TJ grin and tell me the rules. Now I was standing in the woods, the autumn leaves carpeting the ground, feeling sure that it would soon drink both my blood and the girl's. I'll give you till the count of 3 to kill the girl. After that point, you will both be executed. 1. Their guns were unwavering, but so was my resolve. 2. I closed my eyes and prepared to die. 3. I heard a sound like wet concrete splitting open. It was followed by a high-pitched scream and a pair of bodies hitting the ground. I opened my eyes and saw Stein running towards the town car, his composure gone. The 2 men who'd been holding me at gunpoint were bleeding out on the ground from large, grisly neck wounds. As I watched Stein run, a rust-red something snapped out and caught him in the back of the neck, dropping him inches from the town car. The red thing protruded from the front of his neck, and he gasped futilely as he lay dying. I looked back in the direction of the thing that had snapped out and saw that the girl was now a mass of red spikes, segmented like spider legs. Her face had split down long ways, forcing her face into a grisly sideways maw. The area between the teeth glowed a deep red, and I could see the eyes on the girl's face blinking erratically. The 2 halves of her smile grinned at me, and the effect was a little dizzying. I figured for the second time that day that I was going to die, but she scuttled off into the woods instead, walking on her strange spidery appendages as she crashed through the trees. I stood there for a few minutes, not quite sure I believed I wasn't dead, and then I started running too. I crashed through the woods for hours, running in no particular direction, sure that at any minute the creature or a helicopter from 2 Trees would fall on me and either rip me to pieces or just blow me away. I was blundering off with no wallet, no cell phone, just my gun and the clothes I'd been wearing. Was the phone how they tracked me? TJ hadn't said as much, but I kind of figured it was. When the ground went out from under me, I felt the air drop out of my lungs. I fell 5 feet off the muddy ledge and skinned my hands. My knees hurt where I had landed on them, and I realized pretty quick that I had fallen onto the road. If I thought it might be an illusion, the headlights that pinned me to the ground a moment later left me with little doubt. I was kind of numb to the idea of dying at this point, and I just lay there waiting to be run over. Thankfully, the truck stopped, and after a short conversation with the driver, he offered to take me into town. That's how I came to be here in this dingy hotel that just happens to have a computer in the lobby. I sold the gun for about $500 and figured I'd disappear as soon as I'm done writing this. They know I'm gone now, but I don't know if they think I'm dead or if they think I ran. Either way, they'll find me. I'm pretty sure of it. I'm more worried about the little girl that's loose in the woods, and whatever it is that's living beneath their skin. If you see a young girl with short, dirty blonde hair, do not approach her. I don't know if she killed those men to get away, or if she killed them because she wanted to, but she should be considered dangerous if you encounter her in the wild. And if a man from 2 Trees offers you a job, do not become the new curator of Black Site 7. The job is definitely not at all what it appears to be. I looked at the sign over the register and scoffed loudly. It hung above the bowl of fortune cookies like a silent guardian, and it had never made any sense to me. Customers are cautioned to take 1 fortune cookie. Taking more than 1 cookie may be hazardous to the customer's health and sanity. Management. I'd been coming to Yinshi Guzo for the last 10 years, and that sign had always sort of made me roll my eyes. The food this place made was well worth the 5-minute walk from my house, and I had never gotten sick here as I had at other Chinese restaurants. The food was great, the price was fair, and the customer service was second to none. Yinshi Guzo was a place I came to when I was depressed. It was the place I came to when I was celebrating, or when I just needed some comfort food at the end of a long day. It was my all-time favorite restaurant, and I couldn't think of anywhere I'd rather eat. I had actually met my wife here 5 years ago, in fact. Her date stood her up, and I was coming in for some takeout. We both sat in the waiting area, her hoping for a table, since the place was bustling, and me just waiting for my takeout, and struck up a conversation. By the time my food came, she had asked me to stay and eat with her, and I agreed. A year later, we were married, and we've been together ever since, and coming back to Yinshi Guzo as well. I was here again on a Friday night, date night for me and Lisa, waiting for our usual. Sesame chicken with pork fried rice for her, General Tso with white rice for me, and an egg roll each. It was crowded. Yinshi Guzo was always crowded. As I stood before the counter, the sign irked me as I saw it again, probably because the cookies here were my all-time favorite part of the meal. The owner is a world-class pastry chef, as well as a great cook. He makes the cakes for the shop, and his fried cheesecake is to die for. I think his fortune cookies, though, are the best I've ever had. I know that some of you are going to tell me that fortune cookies aren't an authentic Asian delicacy, but this guy has embraced them at Yinshi Guzo. He makes them from scratch, putting the fortunes in himself, and they're so buttery and delicious that I could eat them by the ton. He refuses to sell them, though, saying that they're only meant to be enjoyed one at a time, and I can't imagine how much money he loses making them like that. Wrapped delicately in their paper holders, they mocked me from the bowl as I stood looking. Leaning forward, I grabbed about 6 of them and popped them into my pocket. I couldn't tell you why I did it, not really, but it was something that I would come to regret. "Your order, sir," said the voice of Miss Kim as she came back. I jumped, looking guiltily as I smiled and thanked her for the food. As I turned to go, I heard her say something almost too low to hear. "Be careful with those. Remember the rules, sir." I turned back, but she had disappeared behind the curtain that separated the front from the back already. I shook it off. I must have misheard her, I thought to myself, as I took my food and left. I traversed the street, weaving between couples and clumps of people on their way downtown, as I made my way home. As I walked, I felt the cookies shuffling around in my pocket and decided to have one. I reached in and pulled out the hand-wrapped paper cover, looking at the little message scrawled on the outside. Good fortune had been written on it, and I opened the wrapper and picked the fortune out as I ate the delicious cookie in a single bite. It was still soft and warm, and the cookie tasted fresh from the oven. They always seemed to taste like that, and I assumed he made them fresh every day. I looked down at the little paper and thought for a moment that it might have been handwritten, too. Did the owner handwrite his fortunes or something? That level of detail really made these all the more special. I smiled as I read the fortune. Even if it was handwritten, it was still kind of generic for a fortune cookie. Tumultuous times are right around the corner. Aren't they always, I said to myself, putting my key into the lock as I stepped inside. 10 minutes later, I had the wine chilling in the sink, the food transferred to plates, and I'd found the perfect movie on Netflix for us to cuddle up and watch together. I had it all arranged and ready for her. As I switched over to regular TV, the movie primed and ready to play, I looked at my watch and tisked. It was already 8:30. She should have been here by now. She had been working late these past few days, and I was beginning to become worried. I reached into my pocket and pulled out another of the delicious little cookies. I stopped before unwrapping this one, reading the handwritten message on the outside before I opened it. 1 per visit. Don't forget the rules. I felt my brow furrow a little. That was weird. What an odd thing to write on the wrapping of a cookie. I shrugged and pulled it out of its wrapper, pulling the fortune out as I ate the cookie. This one was good, but not as good as they usually were. It was buttery, but a little dry. Tasted like a leftover from yesterday's batch. A sports center came on. I looked at the scrap of paper inside and blew air out in a little chuckle. A loved one is thinking of you. Another classic. My phone rang about that time, and I picked it up, looking at the picture displayed on the home screen. Lisa's smiling face decorated the screen, and I smiled to myself as I picked it up. Hey, honey, you almost here? I got everything ready for date night. Her breathing on the other end was heavy, and it took her a minute to compose herself. Babe, I need to tell you something. I need you to not interrupt me, okay? That made me nervous. Lisa sounded panicked, and I didn't like the thought of her driving while she was in that state. I could hear the sound of her engine in the background, and it sounded like she was driving very fast. I looked at the clock and realized it was later than I thought. Traffic could be nuts this time of night, and I wish she would pull over. Are you okay? You sound like you're... Just listen, and don't interrupt, okay? Okay, I said, hoping this would calm her down a little bit. I took out another one of the cookies as she prepared to speak and unwrapped it absent-mindedly, taking the fortune out with a deft hand. I'm pregnant, she said quickly, in a way that made me think she was expecting me to be upset. Quite the contrary. We had been trying to have a baby for years, but couldn't seem to make it stick. We thought we'd finally made it work a few months ago, but she had ended up miscarrying, and it had hit her really hard. She had really fallen into work, staying late and working on her off days, and these date nights had become our only real time to be together. The news that she was having a baby made me ecstatic. I was confused as to why she was so upset. The cookie was dry as I crunched on it. This one was definitely stale. That's wonderful, dear, I said, through a mouthful of cookie. I'm so happy you... It's not yours, she exclaimed, and the cookie turned to ash in my mouth. I felt it stick in my throat, a dry paste turning to cement, and I hacked it up and spat it on the carpet. It looked a little off as it sat in the congealing mass there, but my mind was not on the cookie. Not mine. How could that be? I've been having an affair for the last 3 months. When we lost Davin, I couldn't get over the depression. Someone at work had been flirting with me for a while, and one night oh God, babe, I don't know what to do. She was crying, and I could already hear it turning jagged and ugly. I wanted to be angry. I tried to be furious, but I couldn't in the face of her sobbing. Come home. We'll work this out, Lisa. We can... Huh? She huffed out, and I heard a loud pop of static before the line went dead. Hello? Hello? Lisa, are you there? Hello? But there was no one. I sat forward, bumping the table and sending the plates I had made spilling onto the ground. I heard the dry snap of the other 2 cookies as they crumbled in my pocket, but I hardly noticed. I tried calling her back, but it went straight to voicemail. I called again and again, becoming more frantic with each phone call until I finally bounced it off the carpet floor in a rage. What the hell was going on? What had happened to Lisa? I felt something papery against my palm, and when I looked up, I saw the fortune was plastered against it. I caught sight of the words, and it quelled my rage with cold fear. Your joy will quickly become ashes in your mouth. What the hell was that? That wasn't a normal fortune. Fortunes from cookies were almost always benign, or at least neutral. Did the owner write these himself? Who the hell would put a thing like that in a cookie? I stared at it for a few minutes before retrieving my phone and trying to call her back. The screen was cracked, but that hardly seemed to matter anymore. As my phone remained silent and hers remained unreachable, I was becoming scared. What if something had happened? The fortune continued to nag at me. So far, each of them had been accurate in their own way. What the heck was going on here? This was too elaborate for a prank, and if it was, it really wasn't amusing. I had started to clean up the food I had spilled when the phone finally began to ring. I grabbed it up and prayed that it would be her face I'd see on the screen. Instead, it was a blocked number. It looked odd through the star pattern of my broken glass, and I sat it down. I could once again feel the broken cookies poking at me from my pocket. I reached in and threw both of them on the table. One of them had come unwrapped, and the fortune stuck to my finger as my hand came free. My curious mind would not allow me to ignore it, though, but now I wished I had. You will receive 2 phone calls. Both will bring you only sorrow. I caught the still ringing phone on the 4th ring. Hello? Lisa? I asked hopefully. Hello. Are you the emergency contact for Miss Lisa Callahan? I am, I answered, unsure of what it wanted. This is Officer Winsman. I'm afraid there's been an accident. Is my wife okay? I asked, still a little hopeful. The officer was silent for a few seconds. I'm gonna need you to come down to St. Mark's and identify our remains. The phone slipped out of my hand again, and I could hear the officer saying hello from the carpet. The last cookie sat on the table, ominous in its white paper holder. The edges of the paper were black, whatever was inside having seeped into it. The covering bore a legend that made my breath hitch, and though I felt my hands reach to open it, I wanted nothing so much as to throw it out the window unread. The black letter on the front read, "Those who do not follow the rules are doomed to live with the consequences." My shaking fingers found the white paper just as the phone went silent. I've been lying on the floor of my apartment, smelling the aroma of old Chinese food for the last 3 hours. I don't know what to do. Someone came to knock on my door, but I ignored them. They said they were with the police, but I don't care. Lisa is lost to me, and I fear that may not be the end. I'm almost glad that it may not be the end. The world outside has quieted some as the night stretches on, and I continue to lay on the carpet in the fetal position, using what may be my last few hours to write this message. The black stuff that poured out of that wrapper, bits of moldy cookie floating amongst it, was nothing next to the message that oozed onto the surface. Your end will not be so quick as hers, it said. So if you read this, and you should see that sign telling you only to take 1 cookie, remember that the rules are there for a reason, and those who do not obey them may be forced to live with the consequences. I've been sitting on this for a little while, but I think it's time. This happened about 3 years ago. I was, without a doubt, the worst kind of hiker. You know those guys who are all leave no sign, bagging their garbage, burying their poop, cleaning up their campsite, respecting nature's natural beauty and all that? Yeah, that wasn't me. I liked camping. My parents liked camping. But there was always a mentality of the woods will take care of things. I watched my dad leave a whole cooler full of empty beer cans at the site one time when I was 8. We brought a couch with us on a camping trip one time, just because Dad knew of a ravine nearby. Broken fishing rods? Left those by the creek. Garbage? Right on the ground. Hell, we left a whole tent once because Dad couldn't get it back in the bag. We didn't use campgrounds either. Mom and Dad would pack up and find somewhere in the middle of nowhere and just live off the land for a couple of days, then leave their crap behind. I can't say that this is why I am the way I am. I know better than to litter and be a pig, but in my head, The woods will always take care of themselves. It's been here for millions of years. Why is my trash and stuff gonna mess with it? If my styrofoam cooler kills a couple of trees, then they didn't deserve to be there, right? That's what I thought, at least. I go camping about 3 times a year. The start of spring, the start of summer, and the end of summer. I live in California, so I always just pack up my pickup, get some food and beer and recreational greenery, and head out to somewhere remote. A buddy of mine from work hadn't shut up about this overlook an hour from the city, right outside the Santa Lucia mountain range, and I figured I'd go crash out there for a weekend. Unlike my parents, I'm not a living off the land kind of person. I brought food, I brought stuff, and I intended to do nothing but sit in the wilderness, sleep in my hammock, and get buzzed. I called out Friday and found the perfect spot by lunchtime. It was gorgeous, overlooking the valley and so remote that if I were to get really hurt, I'd probably die out here with no one the wiser. I set up my hammock, set out my fire logs with some water, just in case, and just kinda spread out a bit. I made some lunch, sandwiches, rolled a joint, and just kinda got mellow for a bit as the day rolled on. It was nice out here, just watching the clouds and listening to nature. I was soon pretty well lit, and the sun started creeping down as I set to lighting my fire. There was probably a burn ban in effect, but I had water, and I didn't care. Out here, no one was going to see me anyway, and I started roasting hot dogs as the sun cut a fantastic line across the sky. That was the first time I noticed them. I remember looking up and whispering, "Shit," as I mistook them for rangers or cops or something. They were just silhouettes on the ridge, not far from my camp, 3 or 4 of them, and they had these wide, flat-topped hats, like park rangers or the guy on the oatmeal box. I watched them for a minute, thinking I was busted, but they just stood there. They didn't move, they didn't call out, but I know they saw me. My fire had to be visible for a ways at this height, and the longer they stayed there, the more creeped out I felt. Why were they just standing there? If they wanted me to leave, then why not tell me to leave? I didn't know, but once the sun set, I noticed they had vanished and just kept an eye peeled. I had my gun, a big old .45, so I wasn't worried, but I suddenly wished I had a tent to sleep in instead of just a hammock. I sparked up again after eating a pack of dogs, though, and that took some of the edge off. Took any thought of the shadow guys out of my mind whatsoever. I dozed off in my hammock, but I dreamed about them that night, too. I dreamed that they were in my campsite, just standing around and watching me. They were like the outlines of people, like when someone stands in front of the sun and all you get is a burnt-out image of them. They didn't have any features, no eyes or anything, and I was frozen there as they looked at me. They didn't say anything, they just watched me, and it felt like being sleep paralyzed the whole time. I woke up after dawn, almost fell out of my hammock, and started making breakfast as I stirred up the ashes of last night's fire. I wondered if it had really been a dream or not, but I felt like it must have been. Why would they come out here not to say anything? All my stuff was there too, down to the hot dog wrappers I'd left on the ground next to the fire. I tossed it in absent-mindedly and ate eggs and ham. The ice was still holding out. It was spring and not too hot yet, so I decided to go for a forest pub crawl today. Translation, I put a bunch of beer into my backpack and walked out into the woods so I could have a drunk hike. I spent about 5 hours hiking in the woods, tossing my dead soldiers into the trees as I finished them. Some of them broke, most of them didn't, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I hiked in the woods. I never saw anything. Wasn't like I spotted someone hiding behind a tree, but it was like deep pockets of shadows that shouldn't have been there. It was midday, the sun was high, and I should have had major visibility. Even so, I found myself looking around as the crawling feeling just got worse and worse. Some of it was being drunk in the hot woods with no water. and when I found a stream, I plunged my face into it to get some clarity. I drank a little. Dad always said running water was fine to drink from, and when something snapped not far behind me, I looked up like a zebra at a watering hole. I looked around, trying to find what was stalking me, but there was nothing, just the quiet forest and the gently rushing stream. No, I didn't believe that. I'd felt like I was stalked all day, and as I watched the trees, I felt sure that something moved out there. I got up and started running, the zebra analogy too hard to break, and I kept waiting for the claws to sink into me, the teeth to bite, the hot breath to fall on my neck. It was going to come at any minute. I could feel it. And when I tripped over a fallen log, I just lay there and waited for the end. It would get me now. It would get me, and I'd be dead. I'd be dead. Nothing happened. I lay there for about 10 minutes just knowing that it would get me when I moved, but it never came. When the ants started to bite my legs, I sat up and swiped at them. I'd fallen next to an anthill, and I had accidentally stomped on it in my haste, and they were mad as hell about it. I ended up going back to the creek to wash them off, a haphazard trip that took me another 10 minutes, and I was still looking around like a scared animal. I sat with my legs in the creek until they had stopped throbbing, and then made my miserable way back to camp. It was not as much fun walking back as it had been walking out, and I was jittery and tense the whole way. The sun was starting to slip down, and I absolutely didn't want to be out here when it got dark. Too many things could be crunching around out here in the dark. I made it back to camp before it got dark, and as I cooked my dinner, the sun started to ride low again. It was more hot dogs tonight, cooked over the fire, but I couldn't finish all of them. I was too scared to look away from the ridge, and I ended up burning more than one of them. They tasted fine either way, but I had eyes only for the shadows on the ridge. They had the same wide-brimmed hats. A few of them had canes, but none of them were really people. They were like shadows, the images burned at Hiroshima, the photo negatives that sometimes get burned into old photographs. All of them at once, and none of them at all. They just stood there, watching me. They didn't move. They didn't stir. And as the sun sank, I became colder and colder. I should have gone to my truck and left, but I didn't. I made myself put it out of my mind. I convinced myself that I was just being foolish. When it got dark, I got in my hammock and tried to get comfortable, but it wouldn't come. My leg hurt. I was sunburnt. I was hungover. I was dehydrated. I was, but ultimately, I was afraid. I was afraid that when I closed my eyes, they would get me. I was afraid they would just carry me off into the night and I'd never be seen again. They would find my truck and my campsite, but never me. Maybe, I thought as I finally nodded off, someone would look up one afternoon at sunset and see me on that ridge too, just watching. I must have fallen asleep, and I like to think I dreamed what came next. I want to, but I can't convince myself that I did. I woke up and saw them standing around me. I could see them, and not just the ones in front of the fire. They were darker than the night itself somehow, and they began to creep closer to me. Crept is the wrong word, though. They slid along the ground like ghosts in some of the horror movies I'd watched as a kid. They hemmed me in, my body shaking, but my voice stuck in my throat. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare speak. And as they knelt around me, I heard whispering. It was a terrible sound, and it follows me into sleep sometimes. You come here to the womb of creation and leave your waste. You are a brainless creature fit only to destroy things made by your betters. You burn the wood of a creature who has existed before you were more than a twinkling in your father's eye. You destroy a place that was new when this planet cooled. You throw your trash into a home shared by 100 billion organisms. and you claim to be superior here. The better. You are nothing. You will die and be forgotten. On and on and on. They whispered endlessly to me, telling me how worthless I was, how I was a nuisance and a nothing, and how I would never change. Then, one of them rose up above my hammock, his body seeming to hang over me, like a shadow cast from above. He looked like them, but he was clearly their boss or something, and when he brought the cane down on nothing but air, I heard it crack like a thunderbolt. Go back to your stinking pit, but be warned. The next time you come to our woods and ruin our place, you will not be allowed to scamper off so easily. You are a stunted thing who was taught badly, but ignorance is forgivable. If you persist in this folly, we will not be so kind again. Now go, it yelled, and I opened my eyes to find that it was morning. I was laying in my hammock, piss dribbling down my leg, and I knew that I better not be here when the sun came up. I cleaned up everything. I picked up all my garbage. I cleaned up my site. I poured water over the fire and mixed it with dirt like they had always said to on TV. Then I took everything with me, and I ran for the truck. That was Sunday, and I've been kind of afraid to leave my apartment. What if they're waiting out there for me? What if they find me slipping, or they don't like that I don't recycle or something like that? What if I offend them and they drag me back to the woods to be punished? That's part of why I'm writing this. If you're like me, someone who doesn't care about their mess or just leaves the woods wrecked, then watch out. Don't let the Dark Watchers catch you messing up their forest, because they do more than just watch. Don't let them see you slipping, or you might find out what sort of punishment awaits those who anger them. Mel was having a cup of coffee at his favorite little spot one day, when something would take place that he would never forget. He was sitting at the bar area, people watching, as he often did, when an older man and his granddaughter walked in. The two were a study in contrasts. She a young waif so full of life and potential, he a stunted creature whose life was almost used up. His cane was barely audible over the general clamor, but Mel still heard the harsh chock, chock, chock as he walked across the tiled floor. The sight of him made Mel chuckle, though every step seemed to threaten to spill him to the floor. He held the girl's hand in his wrinkled one, and she beamed up at him with genuine love. They were standing in line for a booth, the coffee shop very busy, and as the girl gabbled happily to herself, the old man leaning on his stick, taking it all in as if just happy to be able to still take in anything. Mel felt that his interest was becoming voyeuristic, but he just couldn't look away from the pair. They were so different from the usual people that flitted into the shop, and it appeared that he wasn't alone. Two women and one of them had noticed the pair as well. Mel spent some time observing them as well, hoping to see the same interest or happiness that he had felt. But what he saw was very different. The girl appeared to be filled with a mixture of trepidation, fear, and resolve that Mel had never seen before. Mel had felt like a voyeur, but the young girl was like a hawk who's seen a rabbit. She didn't look away, seemed unself-conscious of her attention, and had eyes only for the little girl and her grandfather. The other said something to her, grabbed her arm fretfully, but she pulled away as she said something quick and harsh to her. As they waited, the little girl suddenly noticed the pair and told the girl how pretty she looked. The girl's attention was broken suddenly as she looked down at the little girl in surprise. She bent down on a knee, and Mel could see her point to the little girl's shirt and say something that made her giggle. Then she pointed to the old man, her lips asking if this was her grandpa, and the girl giggled as she answered that this was her papa as she clung to the man's hand. He turned to give the girls a slight nod and a smile before turning back to the barista who had arrived to seat them. The two girls watched them go before seeming to decide to come to the bar, where Mel was sitting instead of waiting for a booth as well. As they took their seats beside him, the one who had been watching so intently was still staring at the pair. As the old man smiled happily at the young girl and the doll that she was dancing across the table, the girl's face kept that same look of resolve. She clearly had something to do, something she was loath to do, but had to do, nonetheless. It was clear that it had something to do with the old man and his daughter. "They're quite the pair, aren't they?" Mel asked, making her jump as she blushed shyly, having been caught looking. "You have no idea," she said, her accent strange and exotic. Mel thought she might be from the Middle East, or maybe Northern Europe. The barista came around about that time and took her order. Mel couldn't help but notice the resemblance. The two girls were quite dark, their hair long and black as it spilled down their backs, and as the one with the intense stare leaned in to whisper to the waitress, Mel saw the new girl look over at the pair sitting at the table. She nodded and brought the two girls coffee as she went to bustle in the kitchen. "Do you know them?" Mel asked, becoming very curious as the exchange went on. "Unfortunately, I do," the girl told him, sipping her coffee. The longer he looked at the girl, the more Mel suspected that she was foreign. This was Sweden, of course. There were foreigners everywhere these days. But she also looked foreign in that way that people look out of time. The girl, as he thought of her, was likely in her mid-20s, but her eyes led him to believe that she had lived more in those 20 years than Mel had in his 37. She had lived through terrible times, seen atrocities, and had come out on the other side. He noticed movement from the table where the little girl sat with her father, and she squealed a little as a mountain of whipped cream and sprinkles was delivered atop some chocolate confection. To the father went a far more sensible coffee and a scone, and Mel thought the old man might have made out better. The shop's scones were to die for, and were less likely to put you into diabetic shock. "You probably just made that little girl's day," Mel said offhandedly, guessing the woman had sent the order there. She sighed. "I hope so. I would like to give her some joy on what may be the worst day of her life." Mel looked at her questioningly, but the woman had eyes only for the old man as he sipped before adding sugar to his coffee. "I met him in 2007, when I was 12 years old, and I've spent the last 17 years tracking him down. He has been my sole obsession, my reason for living, and every time I thought I might simply lie down and die, his face pushes me on." She stiffened a little as he looked down at the scone, but his granddaughter did something to steal his attention, and he looked away. "Must be a hell of a story," Mel commented. "Would you like to hear it?" she asked, still not looking away from the old man. "It appears we have some time." Mel wanted to decline, but instead he nodded as he invited her to continue. "It all started when the Russian army invaded our lands." When she started talking, there was no way that he could make her stop. Once she got started, there was no way he would want her to. "When I was little, we lived on a farm far from here. Our town was small, little more than a farming community, but we were happy. My family kept goats, sheep, chickens, cows, and horses. We made a living selling milk and eggs, wool and cheese, and our family was large. I had 9 siblings, 5 boys and 4 girls, and we helped my mother and father with the daily chores and the running of the farm. So when the Russian army pushed a little further, we became afraid. We could see the smoke, we could hear the gunfire sometimes, and the army was nowhere to be seen. The townspeople raised a militia, but it was no match for the might of the Red Army. They shot our young soldiers, our hunters, our ranchers, and marched into the town over the backs of the broken. We could see them from our farm, Father had not joined them, and we knew that the bad times would soon be upon us. She paused, watching as the man took the scone in his hand before setting it down again. She sighed, saying something in a language I didn't know, before continuing. We were all brought into the town the next day, some of us by force, and taken to the meeting hall in town so we could meet our new overseer. The mayor had stood with the men of the militia and had been killed, so the man who stood on the stage was as different from the mayor as night to day. The mayor was a big bear of a man, and he was kind to his friends and neighbors. This man, slight and wearing a military uniform, looked more like Father Christmas. He was an older man, his face a smiling mask that he showed us with great excitement. His eyes, however, reflected none of the smile on his face. He told us his name was Major Krishker, and that he would treat us as well as we treated him. That turned out to be a lie. For the first few weeks, all proceeded as normal. The soldiers and the overseers toured the town, took in the farms, saw the markets, met the people. The man was courteous, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. The people thought that maybe the occupation would not be so bad. Perhaps he would be a kind overseer, and when he moved on, the town would still be as it had been. They could not have known how short a time that peace would be. It began with simple theft. The soldiers came to our farms and demanded that we give them a portion of our crops. Not much, they said, only an amount that came to around 25% of our total crop. Now, the mayor had always requested a third, so Father was excited that we wanted less. The mayor had already taken his share, however, and Father told the soldiers this. Taking more would cut into the food we had for winter, but the soldiers said he didn't care. You will give us what we ask for, or it will be taken, they said, and thus we gave it to them. My brothers, none of whom had gone to fight, became angry at this, but Father told them it would be okay. It is not winter yet, and we will grow a little more before it comes. Next came the conscriptions. They told every male over the age of 16 in the village that they would be conscripted into the Red Army. They would be trained, they would be paid, and they would be able to send money back to their families. 3 of my brothers were of this age, and they were taken for training, despite their protests. My father continued to say that this was okay. They would send money back, and our lives might be better. Father had forbidden any of his children to join the militia, but it seemed the war would take them nonetheless. My older brothers left on a truck that day, and we never received money or letters, or saw them ever again. Mel began to worry about the direction of this story. He was expecting a heartwarming tale about someone helping a town in a time of strife. He had hoped that maybe the girl was repaying a kindness to the old man, but the longer the story went on, the less and less he thought it was so. Taking another look at the little girl, who was dancing her doll around the sugary confection, Mel thought she looked different from the old man who sat across from her. Her hair was darker, her features less harsh, but she was young, and he was very old. With so many of the men gone, next came the brutality. The soldiers didn't need to tax anymore. They came and took what they wanted. Our cows, our chickens, our sheep, our goats, our crops. Even a few of my sisters were taken in by the soldiers and came back with bruises and tear-streaked faces. I was young, but I saw the look they gave me as well. My father kept me home, not wanting me to go to the village, but when the food prices rose and our trade began to dwindle, Father found it hard to feed his remaining children. It was only myself, my younger sister Hetz, and my other sister, Gretel, and my older sister, Farah. and, of course, my older brother, Philip. Mother and father tried their best, but when the overseer came to our farm one day, father knew he couldn't hide me any longer. He came to the house, introducing himself as if we didn't already know who he was, and sat at my parents' table to discuss the reason for his visit. He insisted I be there, a girl barely 13, and I remember hating the way he looked at me. He said he had seen me in the market and wanted me to come and stay with him at his villa, saying he would give me a better life and offer me opportunities I wouldn't receive here. Father knew why he wanted me. We all did, but my surprise was real when he agreed. He took the man's hand and promised to send me to him the very next day. "Let us get her ready, and we will bring her to your villa tomorrow," he said to the overseer. And the man was happy. He left, and father got to work. He knew what it would mean if he defied this man, and he had seen the stockades in the square, but he didn't care. They had taken his oldest sons, his livelihood, and he'd be damned if he would let them take his daughter, too. Father loaded me into a grain wagon, and my siblings took me out of town. As we left, I peeked from the back and realized I could be seeing my home for the last time. I found it hard to be quiet as we went, and my crying must have attracted attention. Some of the soldiers stopped us and threatened to search the wagon. Sara was the oldest. Father had tasked her with keeping us safe, and when she offered to go off with the soldiers if they would let us pass, we knew we would never see her again. My brother Philip took the reins, and we left Sara behind. I never saw my parents again. I never saw my brothers again. We kept moving until we came to a town where we had cousins. They helped us and gave us shelter, but I never forgot that man or what he did to our village. We learned later that he took all he could from the land and left it to ruin. He hung my father and my mother and took Sara as his wife. He left us orphans, destitute, and I've never stopped thinking about that man. When I heard that he had fled here to escape justice after being declared a war criminal, I knew our time for revenge had come. Mel had been so focused on the story that he didn't look back at the man until he started gagging. His hands were on his throat, his face puffing as he hacked, and the little girl was now asking if he was okay. There was real fear in her voice, and people were trying to help him. But in the fuss, only Mel saw the other girl, the one who had come in with the storyteller, take the girl by the hand and lead her away. The little girl looked back only a single time, calling for her papa, before the two left. Mel heard the storyteller get up, but before she left, she turned to give him one final detail. "The little girl is my niece, Farah's child by this man who is old enough to be her grandfather. Farah died before he went into hiding, but when we heard that he had fled with a little girl, we knew what we had to do. I remembered one other thing when I was planning this. When he came to the house to ask my father to send me, he told my mother 3 things as she offered him tea and cakes. The first was that he took his coffee black. The second, that he could not abide dairy. And the third was that he had a strong allergy to nuts." She smiled, dipping into a bow as the barista, who had served the two, told her it was time to go. "When you tell the people how I killed one of Russia's monsters, tell them I killed him not with a gun, not with a sword, but with a scone that hid a hand full of walnuts." I've worked at the homeless shelter in my town for about 7 years. In 7 years, I've done just about everything there. Cooked the food, cleaned the toilets, set up and run the AA meetings, done the little security work, Hell, I've been a glorified babysitter more nights than I can count. In all that time, though, I've come to care for the people who wander in, looking for a dry place to sleep and a warm bed for the night. I know everyone who works night shifts says this, but the night shifts at the shelter really are different from day shift. The day shift has no less than 6 staff in the kitchen. That's helpers and a chef, though he's less of a 5-star chef and more of a Waffle House fry cook. They've got 5 therapists and a doctor, as well as 3 nurses in the medical facility, and 6 staff members who do everything from answer the phones to clean the toilets. During the day, this place is more like a Howard Johnson than a shelter, but at night, it's more like a youth hostel. The night shift has 5 employees, a cook and a kitchen helper, both of whom are gone by 10, a nurse, who mostly tries to keep everything stable until morning, and 2 staffers who keep the place from falling apart. I am one of the latter. It's a strange way to do things, I know, but management figures that at night the residents should be sleeping and thus need less care. In all the time I've been here, I've broken up many, many fights, held a lot of hands while people were puking their guts out, waited on ambulances while someone had a seizure or went into convulsions, and herded scared residents into the hallway while someone went through a violent DT spell or ripped the dorm apart. I've also seen a small group of residents put on a production of A Christmas Story, seen them exchange gifts under a tree on Christmas Day, throw a regular resident a surprise birthday party, and help each other through loss and pain. The homeless community is a lot more tight-knit than anyone would ever believe, and despite its many problems, I've never had an incident like I did the night in question. That was the night that all hell broke loose. It happened about 3 weeks ago, December 18th, and I had just walked in out of a nasty blizzard. The weather is never what you'd call good, but today's weather was a killer. I crunched in a little before 6 and said hi to Janice, who was at the front desk that night. She looked up from her Candy Crush long enough to give me a half-hearted wave, which I returned before heading to the cafeteria. Dinner service was just starting, so I put on an apron and helped out. Chad, the shelter cook, doesn't like non-kitchen staff in the kitchen area, so I bypassed the back and took a spot on the line, where I passed out bowls of soup and grilled cheese sandwiches. I greeted some familiar faces, talked to some people I knew for a few minutes, and scanned the room for my regulars. There are many faces you know in a shelter, and those were the faces that I was looking for. I saw Lou and Chuck sitting around a table that was packed with other drifters. Chuck was telling a long and excited story to a crowd of homeless and stopped long enough to wave at me when he saw I was looking at him. Lou waved too, smiling, and Chuck went back to telling his story. While Lou was a classic example of a city vagrant, Chuck was what you'd call a traveler. He'd been here a few months, said he liked the architecture of our town, but before that, he claimed he'd been most everywhere. I've picked oranges in Florida for 50 cents a crate. I've brought in Idaho spuds for $2 a bag. I've worked in greasy spoon diners and driven cabs in New York City. And I'm here to tell you, girl, that I've seen just about everything this great nation has to offer. Probably saved a bundle, seeing as I saw it on my own 2 pins, too, he said as he slapped his leg and chuckled. He and Lou had palled around for a while, and I like to see someone looking out for Lou. As a recovering heroin addict, he doesn't always remember things so well, and if someone like Chuck or Lenny were looking out for him, he'd be less likely to stumble into traffic or hunt for a needle again. As though summoned by the thought of his name, Lenny came stomping up right about then and gave me his trademark Lenny smile, which showcased all 5 of his teeth. "Evening, Miss Liz. How's your night going so far?" I didn't immediately respond, though. Someone in the back had caught my eye. He looked like a mall Santa who had come wandering in for a bite before his shift, and it was certainly the right time of year for him. He wore a dark red cap, had a long white beard that hung to his waist, and was dressed in an old red ski jacket, topped off with a pair of scuffed black motorcycle boots. He sat in the back and ate his meal, and I could see the end of a gnarled wooden stick leaning against the wall within easy reach. He had a big old stained traveling sack perched on it, and it only enhanced the idea that he was some kind of Santa Claus. Lenny looked back to where I was looking for a minute before trying to bring me back to reality, You know that old man, Miss Liz?" he asked, genuinely curious. I shook my head. "No, Lenny, I don't think I've ever seen him before. Have you?" Lenny shook his head in a slow, deliberate way. "No, ma'am. I guess he must be from out of town, like Chuck," he said as he pointed to old Chuck, who was miming a fishing net that was full, it seemed, as he yanked it out of somewhere. I gave Lenny his food and made small talk. He responded with his usual sermon. He had woken up, got dressed, and he and Lou had gone down to Panhandle on their favorite corner. They had left before noon, since that's when the cops usually came around. They'd eaten their lunch at the shelter, then spent the afternoon looking for cans and bottles to recycle. Each of these pronouncements contained a "by Jesus" or "by the grace of God, amen," and Lenny was a firm believer in the power of God, and believed that his mercy was the reason he was still alive today. A staunch atheist I may be, but I wasn't about to dampen his spirits. I gave him an extra grilled cheese, and he went over to sit with his friends. After dinner service, most of the residents went to the activity room to watch TV, or hung out in the dining hall to talk. I took this opportunity to visit one of my friends in the medical bay before it was time to call lights out. The medical door sits right across from the welcome desk, where Janice was still on her phone as she had been earlier. I ducked in and received a nod from Miss Casterly, our resident night nurse, and I said hello to some of my other residents that were in here. Miss Casterly and I have a lot in common, at least in my mind. She's a retired school nurse with 5 years of nursing school before discovering her passion for teaching. Her job is to put Band-Aids on it and keep it from getting out of control until the doctor gets here in the morning. In many ways, I have much the same responsibility. I've always seen us as soldiers in the same war, and I think she senses that when we talk. John was in the back. His legs were still wrapped up, and he was covered in quite a few blankets, as the IV dripped him full of warmth. John was one of the residents I had hoped to get off the streets, and before his accident, I thought I had succeeded. He'd been an engineer before his wife left him, and his depression had caused him to slip into a dangerous spiral that had ultimately landed him on the streets. When I found out about his background, I had started trying to help him find a job so he could get back on his feet. When a local factory needed a machinist, John had agreed to give it a try. Then, 2 weeks ago, he'd gone and dropped off the face of the earth. I'd almost given up on finding him again when the hospital called me a few days ago. He'd given them my name just before they were going to kick him out, and I helped him get back to the shelter so he could recover. It turned out he and 5 other homeless guys had been caught out in the blizzard and nearly froze to death under the East Side overpass. His legs had been frostbitten pretty good, but thanks to the hospital, he was recovering nicely, and thanks to the shelter, he'd be able to finish recovering without being turned back out into the blistering cold. He greeted me, and we talked for a few minutes about nothing in particular. I asked him about his recovery, and he said he thought he'd be better in a few days. He asked me if I'd heard from the factory about the job, and I told him they had been understanding once I explained his situation. They had asked me to get in touch with him after John was feeling better, and I told them we certainly would. John thanked me for working so hard for him, and after a little more small talk, I excused myself to go check on the dorms. Had I stayed any longer, I likely wouldn't be alive to tell this story. I had left medical and was going into the dorm area when I heard the front doors open. I felt a blast of cold air run across my back, and I turned to see who'd come in out of the chill. I felt myself stiffen, however, as I saw them. 3 men in overcoats with huge scarves covering their mouths. I couldn't have told you why at the time, but they just struck me as wrong. Their posture made me think of something not quite human, that crouched way of standing that you sometimes see in primates. The way they held their heads made me think their faces were oddly elongated, too. They hadn't seen me yet, and their attention was focused on Janice as she rose to greet them. She got up and walked towards them, asking them to sign in and brandishing a clipboard at them. That was when one of them reached out and broke her neck. Now, I don't mean that they used ESP or telekinesis or anything. When I say they reached out and broke her neck, what I mean is that his hand moved so fast that I couldn't even see it. Janice fell with her head twisted all the way around, and I was left gazing in a stupor. She hadn't moved. He hadn't moved, except for his hand, and she suddenly went from being alive to being dead in the space of 2 seconds. As her body crumpled to the floor, her killer made a muffled sound like a cat yowling and ripped the scarf off his face. Underneath, its face was the no color of static, and its skin seemed to crawl like an army of dead white ants. His face opened and his mouth elongated like a snake dislocating its jaw as it fell on her and started tearing her clothes off. It ripped them open, like you or I might tear the wrapper off a candy bar, and it bent its face down as it bit into her. It pulled and tore chunks of meat away with hungry, feral bites. And it didn't chew the meat so much as the meat dissolved when it came in contact with his skin. I know that's a lot to process, and I know it sounds like it might take a while, but this whole exchange happened in less than a minute from beginning to end. 1 minute Janice was getting up to ask the strangers to sign in, and a minute later she was being chewed on like an animal in a National Geographic film, while I stood there frozen to the spot. I know that makes me sound like a coward, but I couldn't help it. The scene before me was so alien, so shocking, that my mind almost couldn't process it. As the killer hunched, eating, its friends turned and headed into the medical area. Miss Chasterley said something as they came in, but it was drowned out as the whole room erupted into shouts of terror mixed with breaking furniture and alien yowls. Then the thing looked up, noticing me for the first time, and the sight of this strange face and its sewing needle teeth moved me to action. I turned and ran through the double doors that led to the dorm and slammed them shut behind me. I slammed my fist onto the big red button on the wall and sighed as the maglocks engaged behind me. The state required us to install them on the doors to the medical and the dormitory area, which led to the back office. Since both areas contained confidential files, we had to have a way to secure them. And what better way than magnetic locks that exert 1,000 pounds of pressure? I put my back against the door, knowing that these things couldn't get in through that, and we'd be safe until they left or the police arrived. Knowing this, I still screeched when it hit the door hard enough to rattle it in the frame. The residents started coming out then, and the corridor was soon filled with the sounds of running feet and raised voices. Before I knew it, I had 20 or so upset people behind me. When Lenny put a hand on my shoulder, I jumped to the ceiling. His face was ashen, and I could tell that he'd caught a glimpse of the hallway behind me. He opened his mouth, probably to ask what was going on, when an inhuman scream pierced the hallway, and something hit the glass on the door hard enough to send cracks running through it. That worried me more than a little, because that glass is supposed to stop a bullet. The first bullet, at least. This thing had just cracked it with a single hit. The second hit bulged it grotesquely inward, and the third turned it into a square of broken glass and twisted metal rebar. An arm stretched through and began hunting for a latch then. "Lisa, get back!" someone yelled, and I saw Chuck run forward with a fire extinguisher in hand. He slammed the butt of the canister into the arm, but it did no more damage than the shards of glass had. The arm continued to rake around, searching for some way inside, and when Chuck brought the canister down for the third time, it finally seemed to register. It swiped out with those long nails, and the canister parted easily, spraying clouds of foam into the air. Chuck let it go and threw the sputtering thing at the arm, backtracking as he moved towards the group. He turned to me then, and I suddenly realized they were all looking at me, looking for me to guide them out of this situation. I almost laughed at them. What part of this did they think was in the Homeless Shelter Management Handbook? There was no protocol for being set upon by a group of monsters who ignored the laws of nature and did whatever they wanted. They wanted me to help them, but I doubted that anyone could help them. We weren't people to these things. We were just troublesome food bits stuck at the bottom of a can. We were trapped in here, and it was only a matter of time before they knocked down the door, maglocks or not, and turned this hallway into a slaughterhouse. I fell to my knees, wanting to bring them up to my chest, and my body longed to drop to the floor so I could spend my last few minutes hugging myself in terror before the end. I had started to do just that when the sound of a walking stick brought me back to reality. The man who looked like Santa Claus came out of the dormitory and smiled at me in a decidedly up-the-chimney-he-goes kind of way. He said not a word, but went straight to his work, and as the creature's hand scampered about like a long-nailed spider, he drew close and stopped just out of arm's reach. The owner of the hand stopped reaching, and I heard a wet noise that sounded like the worst head cold in history. The thing sniffed at the air like a man sucking up soup, and it said something that I'll never forget. I had to look it up afterwards when I was in my right mind again, but it uttered a single muddy word before trying to pull its hand away. It said Sacerdos and tried desperately to get its hand out of the hole. The old man shot his hand out, quick as a snake, and gripped the wrist in a single gnarled old hand. The creature squealed, the scream too high to be called a scream, really, and the corridor was filled with a pulse of white light. Then it dimmed, and I saw the arm no longer attached to the creature. It disintegrated before our eyes into something like oatmeal and sawdust. The creature went crazy then. Its screams were full of terrible fury as it slammed its misshapen face into the little window and gnashed its two big teeth at the little man. He snapped a finger out then and booped the grotesque thing on its flat nose. In another bright flash, the creature was gone, little more than a greasy cloud in the space of the little window. Through the hole in the door, I could see the other two lumbering out into the hallway, streaked with gore and not even trying to hide their strangeness. I looked over at the little man standing placidly by the door. Some black substance had splashed onto his coat, but he didn't seem to notice. I started getting nervous around him the longer he stood there. The hellish creatures were trapped outside the room, but how dangerous was this seemingly harmless old man who'd reduced one of them to nothing but nothing with a flash of light? When you work with the homeless for long enough, you start to question things like miracles or even the concept of change itself. This old man had just done something that I couldn't explain, and he felt like a piece in a game I didn't understand. A piece that was counter to the things outside, I hoped. "Miss, I want you to release the door and let me out into the hallway," he finally said. I gaped at him. "Sir, those things will kill you. I've already watched them kill at least one person tonight, and I'm not in a big hurry to watch them tear you apart, too." He smiled at me in that Santa Claus way of his. "Oh, I don't think so." I had wondered what brought me here tonight. It appears that the powers that be knew that this was where I needed to be the most. I started to argue with him, but something in his eyes told me that he was going out there, whether I wanted him to or not. I pushed the button, and the door opened. He walked out and said the last thing I ever heard him say. "You won't want to watch this." He strode towards the pair of them as I re-engaged the lock. Suddenly, my eyes were assaulted by a bright flash of light like nothing I had ever seen. I fell behind the door, shutting my stinging eyes, and I could hear other residents yelling in similar pain. The creatures screamed in agony, and under that din, I could hear a sound like sizzling bacon as the old man went about his butcher's work. The whole thing lasted less than a minute, but it was a whole 10 minutes before I could see through my watering eyes. Standing shakily, I looked through the window hole and saw that nothing but the empty hallway remained. No blood, no bodies except for Janice's, and no evidence that any of them had been there at all. I called the police and Mrs. Stone, who's responsible for the interests of the benefactors. The police arrived first. The ambulance they brought with them was a welcome sight. Janice was pronounced dead at the scene, along with 10 others in the medical bay, Miss Chasterley among them. The medics said that it looked like a wild animal had attacked them, and big pieces of flesh had been torn out of them, along with some of their softer parts. The worst was their eyes, which had simply been devoured by whatever had attacked them, and no one was left alive to tell the police anything. The residents and I told them about the 3 men, omitting the old man, but the officers didn't seem to believe that a monster had attacked us. They said it was likely a group of mentally unstable residents with masks that had maybe had a personal grudge against the shelter, and that out of shock we had concocted the rest. Miss Stone arrived then, and I had to tell the story again, but I don't think she believed me either. I was given 2 weeks paid time off while the shelter was repaired, but I'll have to think long and hard about whether I want to return. The idea that this might happen again, has likely happened before, chills me to the bone and makes me question everything I've ever believed in. Who was that old man? Was he an angel? A messenger from God? A creature from space? And what does that make those things that attacked us? I've spent the last 3 nights trying to find forgetfulness in the bottom of a whiskey bottle. Every time I close my eyes, though, I can still see those things. I probably always will. I'm sharing this so maybe less equipped shelter workers will read it, and it might help them should this happen to them. They come at night, and they attack your wounded first. They kill without remorse. If I'd seen them on the street, I would have thought they were just normal people. But their coats hide monsters like nothing you'd ever expect. If it happens to you, then I wish you luck. If they find you, then I just hope the old man found you first.